I am Joanne DeGennaro, president of the Center for Excellence in Education, CEE. In 1983, I assisted Admiral H.G. Rickover, father of the nuclear-powered submarine and civilian uses of nuclear power, to introduce exciting educational programs for high school and university students. The Research Science Institute, RSI, was the first U.S. STEM research program to provide opportunities to top-achieving high school students. Now an opportunity for 100 U.S. and international students, the Institute, held at MIT, is for 6 weeks each summer. It has nurtured over 3,000 scholars to date at no cost to them. In 2003, the center inaugurated the USA Biology Olympiad, an online competition for nearly 10,000 students each year, to identify 20 finalists to compete for the 4-member U.S. team to vie for medals internationally. And compete the U.S. team does. Every team member has received a gold, silver, or bronze medal since first participating in the Global Challenge. The mission of the Center's programs for top young scholars is to nurture excellence and leadership in STEM careers. The Center is proud of its 2 newest programs, the Teacher Enrichment Program, TEP, and the STEM Lyceums for Students that have reached thousands online and in person, programming for less advantaged populations and Title I schools. TEP and Lyceum's focus is to pique interest in STEM studies and careers, webinar panels, preparation information for college applications, newsletters, and activities are offered. All CEE's programs for teachers and students are cost-free to all those selected to participate. The center is governed by a prestigious and active board of trustees. Administrative management and programming is provided by a dedicated and brilliant staff with help of alumni of the programs, their parents, and volunteers. Since the center's founding, it has been supported financially by donations from individuals, corporations, organizations, and the U.S. government. The center invites you to become involved and partner with it. If you've not already done so, kindly review the CEE website at www.cee.org. You are also surely welcome to email, telephone, text, or drop into our McLean, Virginia office to learn about the many ways your special skills can further CEE's mission. The center is proud that it is ranked 4 stars by Charitable Navigator. This webinar marks the center's inaugural session as advisor to the Congressional STEM Education Caucus. As advisor, today's exciting and unique presentations will focus on AI for members of Congress, their staffs, and interested individuals like you to help Congress augment best policy and decision-making for educational purposes. It is an honor to introduce Mr. Dave Rensin, distinguished engineer at Google and our moderator. Dave is a former member of CEE's Board of Trustees. He will introduce our two experts, both alumni of the Research Science Institute, who will discuss artificial intelligence issues. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Rensin, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator for this panel today. Before we begin and I introduce our guests, a quick note about our format. I've taken the liberty to prepare a few questions to seed the conversation with our panelists. And since our time together is for a full hour, I thought maybe we could just take the first 20 or 30 minutes for that conversation. And then I will turn the reins of this discussion over to you, the audience. Hopefully in that 20 minutes, you'll have had an opportunity to think of some really interesting and challenging questions for us. So about halfway through, I'll turn the reins over to you. Our focus today for this first STEM session is AI. We want to talk about its trajectory, its promise, and maybe some of its pitfalls too. So with the administrivia out of the way, let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist, Dr. Percy Liang, is an associate professor of computer science and statistics at Stanford University, where he concentrates on machine learning and natural language processing. Percy recently has been focusing his attention on foundational models like GPT-4 and DALL-E, which makes him especially relevant for this discussion. Dr. Liang also holds both a BS and an MS from MIT, as well as a PhD from Berkeley. Percy, thank you so much for joining us today. Our second panelist, Sean Kanuck, is an international attorney and professional intelligence analyst who advises governments, corporations, and entrepreneurs on the future of technology. Sean served as the first U.S. National Intelligence Officer for cyber issues from 2011 to 2016, and he spent 10 years in the CIA's Information Operations Center. He is a frequent speaker, a much sought-after expert in these fields. He has previously given testimony to the Congress, and Sean holds a law degree from Harvard, a master's from the London School of Economics, and an LL.M. From the University of Oslo. Welcome, Sean. So the first thing as attendees you should learn is I am not nearly credentialed enough to be moderating this panel. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. As I said, I prepared a couple of starter questions and that I'll address to both of you, and we'll kick off this conversation. Percy, let me start with you. What is something that you see AI doing today, or maybe you can easily imagine it doing in the very near future, that you might have thought, roughly impossible a few years ago? This can be something good or something bad. Where has it surprised you?
Yeah, gosh, there's so many things that AI is able to do today. I've been in a field for 20 years, and I think that a lot of the advancements that we see from the ability to solve hard math problems or predict protein structures, or just yesterday we saw the announcement of OpenAI's GPT-4o to have fluid conversations with people. I think this is all very impressive, but maybe one thing I'll highlight is what's impressive to me as an AI researcher is how these systems are built. And these systems are built using remarkably the same recipe. So that is training a large neural network on a large amount of data. So these are foundation models, and using a very simple gradient descent algorithm. So somehow we have discovered this recipe such that if you can execute on it, you have the same recipe being applicable to all these different these areas. This was something that wasn't really the case maybe 10 years ago. For those of you who remember, IBM had IBM Watson that beat human champions at Jeopardy. That was a very bespoke system. It took a lot of engineers a lot of time to just design that system that did one thing. Or when IBM Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess in '97, that was a very bespoke system. But for the first time in history, we have seen the rise of these more general purpose systems based on a single principle, which means that what it can do in the future is kind of only a matter of there's a kind of open-endedness, which I find both exciting but also a little bit nerve-wracking.
Sean, same question to you. What's something that it does today, for good or for ill, that surprised you, seemed roughly impossible a few years ago?
Okay, I'll answer you directly, then build on a little bit of what Percy already said. He alluded to it, the protein thing. I am actually amazed at the modeling that AI is able to do today of protein structures and potential new pharmaceuticals that will be interacting with organic elements in the body. I don't think I would have predicted that rapid of development in that area. I'll also say the other thing that's surprising me is how people are using these AI models already, and particularly how much credence they're putting into the outputs of generative algorithms that they don't really know the accuracy of. Okay, it's producing an output, but verifiability of those results doesn't seem to be an issue for people adopting those outputs and publishing them or using them in their term papers or other things. I'd like to pull on another thread that Percy said about the general purpose usage of these. If we follow that to its logical conclusion here in the coming years, AI and this generative and generalized AI is going to become a genuine public infrastructure. It's going to underpin so much of what we do in so many different fields. And if it is a singular or related technologies rather than purely bespoke applications for each instance, you're going to have an underlying public utility. And I think that says a lot, especially for the areas I work in of law, policy, ethics, that need to be considered at this early stage. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is, if we think about the Turing test from computer science, I think some of the interactive models now actually raise the question of how many users would know whether they're interacting with a machine system or a genuine other human being. So there's a few questions out there that 5 years ago, I think we would have been surprised to hear are genuine issues and concerns today.
Let me follow up on that just a little bit, Sean. Since I'm talking to you, I always ask people this question. If I gave you 100 coins, 100 tokens to spend between two buckets, let's call bucket A the, rainbows and unicorn AI is going to be amazing bucket, and bucket B, the Skynet is coming run bucket. How would you divide your coins between those two buckets today, and why?
All right. Well, I spent a long time in government, so these coin studies are pretty common in the military and the intelligence community. And I'm also an intelligence analyst who spent a long time dealing with real pragmatic problems. So my answer is I'm going to spend 100 of my coins on development because prevention or avoidance is impossible. An AI underpinned and infrastructure dominated world is inevitable. You might be able to slow it or stave it off if you try to oppose it, but you are not going to prevent it in the long term. So I would invest in development, and particularly in a public-minded alternative or option. I think about when the internet was invented, and then 30, 40 years later, we're asking ourselves, why can't we do secure transactions with provenance for at least certain kinds of things? We love the free speech and anonymity, but we wish there were certain things that could be more secure and not subject to rampant hacking or foreign intelligence activities. So I would invest my 100 coins in a government-led moonshot, maybe through DOE labs or something, that would produce very sound, long-term options for a public accessible infrastructure. And not to exclude the private sector, but to make sure there is a public-minded option for many future uses that we can envision down the road.
Yeah, but so what I'm trying to get to with this particular set of coins is sort of your, let's call it your mood about the current trajectory. If you had to divide yourself between 0 to 100, between it's all headed in a pretty good direction and it's going to be a great future, or holy crap, we're in trouble. How are you feeling today?
All right, if you're asking me for a threat assessment rather than an investment decision, I will tell you I am 2/3 super excited and 1/3 troubled, because I know how many people are out there who want to challenge our national security or who want to use advanced technologies for criminal ends. So for every 2 steps forward, I think we're going to see 1 step backward. That may be on par with what we see in other areas of cybersecurity. The other issue I have with AI is the malevolents are using AI for their malevolent purposes.
Right.
So every cybersecurity problem we've had in the past is on steroids in the AI environment.
We're going to come back to that. I want to pull on that thread in just a second. Percy, let me give you a chance to answer this too. Tell us about your mood. You have 100 coins to spend. How are you spending them?
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm answering the right question, because I think the original framing was between unicorns and rainbows and Skynet. And I don't really like this polarization. And the reason is that I think there is a lot of confusion these days about the risks and fear of Skynet. And I think, frankly, technology never has the impact that we think it has. You think sci-fi can often be an inspiration, allow people to dream, but often really doesn't, kind of misses the mark on the complexity of the real world. We don't have flying cars, but we have internet and 144 characters and mobile phones. And I think that's why I want to be very precise about what the risks are. And I think Sean put it, I think already alluded to this. Misuse is much bigger of a problem. This is dual use technology. It can be used for good. It can be used for ill. It will just amplify everything that anyone wants to do. And I think it's also the case that the true impact on society is going to be a function of not just the technology, as some technologists like to kind of compartmentalize, but it's fundamentally not the case. It has to be integrated into the whole ecosystem of actors, economic and political actors, having certain incentives to do various things according to those incentives, whether it be disinformation or cyber attacks. And the true impact is really this emergent phenomenon that happens when you have these AI and human systems kind of interacting. And I want to also plus one Sean's comment about public infrastructure. This really feels like 1993 for the internet, right? We are at the beginning. We're at the cusp. We see that this technology could take off in some ways. You asked me, what are the most impressive things that people can do? It's like asking what are the most impressive things people could do with the internet in 93. I mean, it's that sort of, you can name a bunch of things. I can, find some home pages on the site, but I think the true potential of this technology, we just cannot even begin to kind of, maybe comprehend. And I think that's maybe the best kind of reference frame I can provide for thinking about this technology, if we could, for those of you who are kind of remember those early days. Which means that I completely agree with Sean that we need to think carefully about making sure that this goes well. The internet, we learned some things went well, like the anonymity and freedom, but some other things like security maybe left more to be desired. So we're sort of architecting now, and I think it's urgent that we get ahead of this.
Well, let's follow up on that a little bit. So, we have people involved in the legislative and policy portions of this process here on the webinar. What advice do you want to give them in that domain to help steer the ship towards the good outcome? And what kind of protections, or how should they be thinking about the risks of bad actors? And Sean, I'll have the same thing to you as well. What do they need to do and contribute to the good outcome, and maybe not whatever accidentally get in the way or cause the wrong thing to happen?
Yeah. Do you want me to? I can jump in.
Please. Yeah.
Sean can follow up. I think a big thing that we're missing is measurement. You talk about steering the ship, but we don't even know where we are. So I think the first order of business is to be able to see clearly where we are and have chart a course for where we're going. And I think the problem is that measurement in AI has been something that people have been doing for a while. You have the data sets and benchmarks that people evaluate for the last few decades. But the thing is that the technology has developed so quickly that it's outpacing our ability to measure what these systems are doing. Like I said before, AI used to be much more bespoke. We have a system that does object recognition. Okay, we can measure that. Even that's challenging, but at least we have a handle on that. And now all of a sudden we have these general purpose systems. How do you measure ChatGPT? I don't like to anthropomorphize, but it's like asking how do you measure the capabilities of a human? It's of that as a complex system. And now On top of that, now these systems are being deployed in real world settings, and characterizing the impact of that is truly difficult. It's not impossible. I think it just requires more investment and more attention and more research on the problem. And some of the things that we've been doing in my research group is to develop benchmarks that try to holistically capture the behavior of these foundation models. And I know that, for example, NIST and the AI Safety Institute, both in the US and the UK, are taking initiatives to try to focus on this problem of evaluation or measurement.
Just before I throw this to you, Sean, a quick reminder for our audience there. If you're watching in the webinar, there is a Q&A section. You can begin queuing up for questions. We want to start the Q&A in about 10 minutes. All right. Sean, over to you. Same question. What are the kinds of things the Congress can do to incentivize the good outcomes and help steer us away from the bad ones?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of legislative proposals that either directly or indirectly are affected by and affect AI development in the future. So the first thing I'd say is become very well informed, and this is for the members and the staffers, be very well informed so you can fully understand the consequences of the legislative decisions that are being proposed and made in the future. Recently heard a few of the bipartisan senators who put together an educational program in the Senate on AI. That sounded wonderful, whether it's listening to webinars like this or tapping other sources. First thing I'd ask our policymakers is to be well informed, because they're going to have to be making a lot of decisions that relate to this issue. And secondly, I would say invest in publicly minded alternatives or contributions. We know that private sector left alone to its own devices is driven by profit. We saw that in the security shortcomings of a lot of hardware and software products, especially in an entrepreneurial race to market. And if we're looking to have this public infrastructure that Percy and I seem to be both thinking is coming, to have a public interest mindset contributing to it, I think is super important. And Percy used both these words, but he stressed measurement more than evaluation. I'm not imputing a preference to him, I'm just saying he used both. Measurement to me has a scientific or quantitative element to it. What is it able to produce? How wide-ranging or voluminous are the outputs? To me, in an ethical or legal sense, the evaluation is the qualitative aspect of the outputs. I care even more about the false positives and the false negative rates than about the sheer number of quantitative outputs from a system. Okay, I want to know how complete and sound it is from a logical mindset rather than how capable it is. To me, the veracity of its outputs, that to me weighs much more than the sheer measurement. We could have something that can produce 50 million, results per minute, but how many of those are informationally and institutionally useful? And that's something we've seen a lot with big data and cyber operations in the past, is there's a massive difference between data and information. One is just ubiquitous around you, and one is actually useful information you can act on. I think of data as seawater. It's all around you, but you can't drink it for your health. You got to do something and process it to a useful feature before you can actually get value from it if you want to drink it.
You touched on something I want to pull on just a little bit, because obviously your extensive background and expertise in cybersecurity, and it also doesn't hurt that you have a law degree from Harvard. I wonder how you think about the existing laws around cybersecurity. Do you think they're roughly sufficient for this new world? Do you think AI requires an entirely different legal regime? How do you think about this?
Well, law is such a broad field with so many aspects to it. Do I think we have sufficient laws around cybersecurity? The first thing that comes to mind is criminal laws for violators of cyber systems. Yeah, we have in the federal criminal code and in state law the ability to criminalize activity we don't want. I think in civil court cases, the tort area where people do civil wrongs to each other, I think that's developed enough that if you do things through digital means rather than through physical means that harm someone else, you can find recourse under the law. At the regulatory level, the SEC has forced disclosure of material cyber events. We've had an executive order and follow-up activities on what we call a software bill of materials to show the actual contents of a lot of the digital software products you buy. So I think we're doing okay in those areas, meaning we have the tools we would need to do implementation. Now, we can debate how well they're implemented on a case-by-case basis, but I think we have the arrows in our quiver we need to approach those.
Okay.
Interesting areas are product liability, or where insurance liability falls, or where liability falls under insurance cases. And those are some areas that are currently being litigated for cyber. When it comes to AI, I think all those issues exist. And more particularly, the three big issues I see for legal approach to AI, again, because it's going to be in a ubiquitous public infrastructure, are ensuring fair access to it, not just to the most privileged, largest companies or richest individuals. Secondly, is an evaluation of the effectiveness and safety of these algorithms that are being adopted in many sectors. And then third is a disclosure, something like the ingredients on your food packaging. If I'm buying into an AI algorithm for something that could have life and limb or financial consequence, I'd like to be able to know what I'm buying and using. And I'd like to know that less advantaged people in society can also get access to it so that they can compete fairly in our open capitalist system.
Just real quick, and I know that your background isn't necessarily like intellectual property law, but I did notice that last month the Copyright Office issued a ruling saying that AI works cannot be copyrighted unless there was very substantial human creative input. So just, doing a prompt to an image generator. I'm curious, have you given much thought to, what is the role of IP law and how does that go in the AI space? And then I've got some stuff for you as well, Percy.
Yeah, that's a huge issue that's actually been getting a lot of attention, much more than just last month. I believe it was last August, we had the Thaler case in the federal court system, which came up with a similar ruling that an AI-generated image was not capable of copywriting because there hadn't been sufficient human creativity in its authorship. And we use author to refer to both prose and graphic images or music. So this is not just a recent issue. It's been going on for a couple of years, and the recent Copyright Office issuance is consistent with what's the court rulings and other policy statements have been for the last couple of years. I think that's going to get trickier going forward, as it's going to become more and more difficult to determine how much human input was involved and how much computer input was involved. I think the couple instances we've had so far were very ingenuous when brought to the court and administrative system in revealing how much AI was used. I can envision an instance in the future where something is put on the Copyright Office's desk without full and honest disclosure of where, when, and how much AI contribution was put into it. That concerns me. And then, of course, there's totally different tacks you can take. I know in the UK, there's consideration discussion about granting the computer programmers some of the copyright authorship rights to things that are produced that leverage their AI algorithms. So there's a couple different paths you can take. That's going to be a policy decision, probably better left to our legislative friends here, but I think it's very timely. And I think it is going to require some revisiting of the copyright rules, especially as the contribution of human and machine may not be easily distinguishable in the future.
Yeah, the whole prior art law is going to get pretty tricky.
Yeah,
Percy, I want to pivot back to you for just a minute. I read a bunch of your academic work and things that you have said publicly. You speak a lot about transparency in particular in the space. I see a lot of discussion in the ecosystem about open source, or sometimes you see it described as open weights. But I think probably a lot of the attendees today don't quite know what those terms mean or how they should reason about them or what the benefits might be or not be. I wonder if you'd like to draw upon some of your work and explain some of that and offer some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. This could take an hour, but I'll try to keep it brief. So there's open weights, open source, transparency, which are very distinct concepts, which I think sometimes get conflated. So just to maybe set the stage a bit. So we are focused on foundation models, which include language models. These are huge models that are trained on internet scale corpora training data. And the model itself is just a bunch of numbers. Those are the weights of the neural network. That's when people say weights, that's just the model. And you can take a model and then you can use it to power various products like chatbots or summarization system, translation, and so on. But just that's this kind of the central way that it works. And now there's just the focus on open weights for a moment. Open weights means that the weights of a model, so the model is released openly on the internet for people to do stuff with. And the precedent of this comes from both open source software, for example, Linux or Apache, and things that were really instrumental in powering and driving the internet revolution. So open source was critical, and the philosophy there was the source code of software is released, anyone can use it, usually as is, for doing various things. And so that is part of the spirit. The other part is that a lot of the AI, remember, came very recently out of research labs. It's really kind of fresh off the press. And research, open science is sort of, if you're not doing open science, what are you doing? People release a code and data sets and publish papers. So there's a strong tradition of being open with the research, and a lot of these models were research artifacts. Okay, so those two kind of traditions means that there has always been a tendency for models, weights to be open until the last 4 years, with I think starting with OpenAI's GPT-2 model in 2019. I guess it's 5 years now. There is a gradual decline of openness as companies decide that they're not going to release the weights. They're instead going to maybe make them available through API. And the arguments for that are, well, you have these models can be misused, so therefore we must control them. And furthermore, once you release weights, it's you can't really take it back. There's no undoing. If you post something on the internet, it's there. It can, even if you take down the one's website, someone else can copy it. So if you release something that's potentially harmful, then there's no taking it back. So those are the arguments for why it should not be open. And I think on the other hand, why openness is actually critical is that it allows fosters innovation, it fosters science. But as a researcher, if you just have an API, you don't know what's behind that API. The API can go down, and companies have deprecated their APIs, so now research results are not reproducible. So there's a strong research reason for having the openness. You can inspect, you can customize. For businesses, it's also helpful to be able to build on top of these models, to be able to run the models locally, so you don't have to send your private data to a third-party company. So there are many benefits of openness. And now I think the question is, how do you think about the trade-offs, to the extent that there are trade-offs here? And this is where I think, again, I'll go back to measurement or evaluation is really important, because you're comparing apples and oranges. Well, I don't think we have developed a kind of rigorous enough science for understanding what are the trade-offs when models are released, what's a chance of misuse versus the benefits of potentially greater transparency, mitigating concentration of power, and so on.
I apologize, Percy. I'm going to pop in just right here. I see that Dr. Dunn has joined us.
Congressman Neil Dunn represents the 2nd Congressional District of Florida, which includes all or part of 16 counties in North Florida. He is also an active and wonderful member of CEE's Board of Trustees. Neil Dunn is a physician and served in the U.S. Army. He is a founding president of a large surgical practice and has a subspecialty interest in advanced prostate cancer. Dr. Dunn is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, the oldest standing legislative committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. The committee is responsible for energy policy, interstate and foreign commerce, telecommunications, consumer protection, food and drug safety, public health and research, and environmental quality, among other focuses. Additionally, Dr. Dunn serves on the Subcommittee on Health, the Subcommittee on Innovation, Data, and Commerce, the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, as well as the Parliament of NATO and the House Select Committee on the CCP. Dr. Dunn is a member of the newly formed House Task Force on Artificial Intelligence.
Well, thank you very much. First, it's a huge honor to be with you. I serve as the co-chair of the STEM Education Caucus, along with my Democrat colleague, Mr. Auchincloss, and co-chair of the Center for Excellence in Education. And I can't say enough good that what they have done in the past to advance STEM education for our entire workforce and really highlight some great talents with their scholarship programs. I'm especially pleased that you're proactive on the artificial intelligence front. I think that this is an amazing new technology, honestly, with the potential to change education, research, and society at large, quite honestly. We haven't found anything that doesn't affect yet that I'm aware of. I'm so pleased the center is engaging on this early. So, we think of it as a research tool for sure, but also education. One of the first uses I've seen is that it disseminates education very remotely across very broad potential areas where people potentially wouldn't get that education, especially such quality education, such high-tech education, and make it more broadly available around the world or wherever we can have internet, I guess, is the only limitation. As with any new technology, there are threats. AI brings special threats. I know you guys know that more than I do, but I want you to know that we think about that. I sit on that AI task force, and we're working with those very large problems as we sort of go ahead. We've had a chance to meet with a lot of industry experts. I know that Dr. Rensin, you're with Google, I believe, right?
I am, and I am not a doctor, so I can't claim that.
You're probably smarter than any of the doctors I work with. I'm very impressed with all these. If you're not a doctor, at least you're a techie, right?
That's right. Yes, I am a giant nerd. That's looking at my
So
one and only
my
sport
biggest
coat.
takeaway from the committee that I'm on, honestly, is that this has enormous potential to unleash innovation, rather, and inventions as well, but productivity. When I think about healthcare, that's my default thought. I think I could have been a lot more productive with AI available, and I think we could make high-end medical advice much more readily available throughout the internet sphere, the blogosphere, whatever. I think that this is a great thing for us all. I do think that Congress feels pressure to move quickly on some regulations on this because we do see the risk, but we don't want to handicap our innovators, and that's important that our innovators, people like Google, tell us, where we're getting heavy-handed, where we're a problem for the industry. I think a light touch federal regulatory regime is probably the way to go. We want to follow the founding principles of rights and privacy and not be too heavy-handed here. I do think that the Energy and Commerce Committee has forwarded a plan for a privacy framework, a privacy rule that we can start with. We probably will have to change that over the years, but I do think that we have something that we can work with. And that people will find workable. With a final comment that this is important to national security. The other founder, Joanne DeGennaro was with us today, but the other founder was Hyman Rickover. And national security is a big, big, big concern. If we fail on this, I think we fail really big way. And the CCP is always looking for a way to get ahead of us. So with those, I'm going to hope that all our panelists and everybody who's listening engages our panelists so that the United States can continue to be a leader in artificial intelligence. I yield, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dunn. We really appreciate you taking the time to come in. Percy, I interrupted you. I want to give you an opportunity to tie off your thought before we open up questions from the floor.
Yeah, I was basically sort of done, but I think maybe just to hop back up a little bit, I think talking about transparency in light of Congressman Dunn's comments, I think is apt, because I think a necessary condition to even any sort of regulation is knowing and understanding what you're regulating. And I think that right now we sort of lack the transparency. We don't really understand the risks. And to the extent that we can get more transparency and evaluation, then we'll be in a better position to take action.
Outstanding. Thank you. I see we have a couple of questions in the queue. Let's see here. Our first question comes from Manya Tandon, who asks, and I think we'll address this to both of you. Do you think training data also needs to be regulated by the government in terms of where it's collected from or which groups are represented, etc.? If so, how would something like that be enforced? Wow, that's a meaty and thorny question. Sean, you want to take a whack at that one first?
As a lawyer and just my personal, policy or governmental philosophy, I'm always opposed to heavy-handed regulation, but I'm often a fan of disclosure and evaluation. So I think allowing people to know what data sets were used and have a sense of the historical accuracy, the outputs from the system, I think that's very useful. I mean, we have the horrible example of the Los Angeles Police Department trying to get an AI tool trained, and they trained it on historical data from their own department. What happened? It recommended stop and frisks of African American and Latino gentlemen far over anyone else. Well, that's because it was trained on data that was based on human biases, which we now all agree are inappropriate. So I don't want heavy-handed regulation, but I do think some degree of monitoring and disclosure is absolutely relevant, especially for any tool developed in the private or public sector or academia that could ever end up in a public institution's infrastructure.
Percy, to you,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts here?
Kind of what I was going to say, actually.
Sorry to steal the thunder.
No, that's great. I think one thing I'll say is that training data is really the driver of any event. So as a researcher or a practitioner of AI, without data, you don't have AI. And I think this is something that can't be kind of understated. It's not necessarily about the algorithms, it's all about the data. And now, I think to Sean's point, having greater transparency about what's in the training data is sort of a necessary condition to take action. Just because one thing is, it's hard to even say, oh, you cannot put such and such in the training data, or your training must be balanced. It needs to be all contextualized. And once we have transparency about the data, then it enables many other parties, researchers, third-party auditors, to go and understand and kind of inspect and raise red flags when there are any. But unfortunately, we don't have transparency on training data. So one of the projects that we've been working on actively is the Foundation Models Transparency Index, which scores organizations based on how transparent they are with various things. And one of them is data, which means data practices, labor practices, for example, or where the data's sources are, and so on. And there are clear reasons why I think companies are reluctant to share their data. One is copyright is one, and then the other is competitive or pressures. But this is where something that maybe the government can step in and sort of I don't know, I'm not a lawyer or a policymaker, but to step in and either enforce or encourage the greater transparency of data.
Dave, if I may put a practical example on this for our audience, okay?
Sure,
and
please.
Congressman Dunn's a physician, so I assume this will resonate with him. Imagine if we have AI tools in the future which are doing medical diagnoses based on test results, radiological, chemical, others, studies done in the office regarding your physical organism. If I were from a certain racial background, and we do know that certain maladies and diseases have different frequencies in different racial groups, okay, just based on genetics. If I were getting diagnosed, if I were of race A, and I were getting diagnosed by an AI system that had only been trained on data from another geographic area, country, et cetera, which my race was massively underrepresented in, I would have a much less reliability on the results of that AI diagnosis. Where if I knew that I was properly statistically represented in the data sets the AI model was trained on, then I would put more credence in that resulting diagnosis. And that's just to put a practical example in front of us of why transparency on the training data could actually matter in real life situations.
Thank you both. Those are very, very thoughtful answers, and thank you, Manya, for a very thoughtful question. I have another question here from James Crody. James, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. Sean, this one's addressed directly to you. I'm going to read it exactly as it was written, and then you can decide how you want to answer it.
Okay.
Sean, given that the CIA helped fund its development, what is your view of Palantir's AI and how it's making a difference in Ukraine and other foreign conflicts? If you choose, also analyze the AI used by Palo Alto Networks in cybersecurity on the domestic front. Thank you. I told you it was going to be kind of a spicy one.
Okay. Wow. I appreciate the thought behind that question. Secondly, we could do a 2-hour webinar on everything that's in there. Third, unfortunately, there's a certain limitation on some of the things I can talk about, even though I'm no longer in the intelligence community. So I will acknowledge that Palantir was partially funded and their products were developed through use with the intelligence community. I will say that in the intelligence community as an analyst, I had the opportunity to use some of those tools and found them very useful and advantageous in particular applications. I will further say that I do not work either with or for Palantir or Palo Alto Networks in any form, but I believe they have products that have greatly helped both our national security community and our general civilian population. As far as how they're particularly being deployed at the moment in Ukraine or other conflicts, I'm going to demur on that, both out of not having studied that specifically in regard to those two companies and not wanting to consume an inordinate amount of time. So I realize my answer is probably completely unfulfilling. I will simply say those are the right kinds of questions to be asking and looking for better answers to going forward. I apologize to the questioner.
Well, gold star to you, James, for asking the flop sweat inducing question of the session today. Our next question comes from Larry King. Larry asks, if the Congress gets most of its info from developers who may have biases and financial incentives, how can they be trusted? Okay, well, as the moderator, I'm not really supposed to answer questions, but I am going to quibble a little bit, Larry, with the premise of the question. The Congress, I think, is receiving a lot of input, not just from like employers like mine, but also from experts like Dr. Liang and Sean, who are not developers and don't really have a profit motive. But that get off my tiny little soapbox. Percy, let me start with you. Do you think the Congress is taking a reasonable volume of input from the Academy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Dave, that the Congress has involved different members from both tech companies, startups, civil society, and so on. I do think that at the heart of this question, the spirit of this question is that perhaps that the developers have a large influence on how Congress thinks about the technology. Some of this is with very good reason, because developers have more information about what their systems they're developing, so they should know better what the technology can and cannot do. So some of that is warranted. I think the worry, which is right, is that there clearly are financial incentives here that cannot be ignored and have to be taken into account. And just as one declares conflict of interest in certain settings, I think we just have to be honest with ourselves that companies will have incentives to do certain things. Part of it's because it's genuine and they really believe in what they're doing, but obviously companies are have a responsibility. I do think that I have been engaging more with policymakers on some of these issues, and so this is not my training but out of necessity, and given the rise in AI into the sort of public limelight, I think people, researchers like me, kind of have to step in and provide additional voices in this space. I still feel like there could be more of that. I think there are many experts where there's, if you think about academia is not really set up to engage in some of these conversations. At Stanford, we have the Human-Centered AI Institute, and which has a policy team. It makes some of this more natural, but in many institutions, maybe this is there's often sometimes a gap between the technologist and the people in law and policy. But I guess long story short, I think we certainly need to get input from the developers, but we also need more voices in the room as well.
And actually, while you're talking, Percy, we have a question here from Will Ellsworth, which I think both you and Sean have touched on a little bit, but I think you are particularly passionate about. His question is, can you speak more to the role, my screen just scrolled, the role you expect government to play in developing AI capabilities? In other words, what are the odds of a Manhattan Project-esque effort for AI sometime in the next, several years?
Yeah, maybe I can start and then Sean can jump in. I think both Sean and I did talk about the necessity of having government investment in public infrastructure for AI. And I'm not sure I like the kind of the allusion to the Manhattan Project, which has many other much other baggage associated with it. And I think the qualitative nature of AI is very different than kind of developing atomic weapons. But that said, I think the part about focusing and having a mission to do something big, a moonshot, if you will, I think it is warranted. And I think that over AI research was much more, over the last decades has kind of just gone much more into the private sector, to the point where the imbalance between resources and talent and know-how between companies and what's in, even in academia, but also in government especially, is so stark. It's kind of it's night and day in some ways. And I think that great investment in developing in-house capabilities, and this goes to kind of Larry's question as well, to have, once you have capabilities and have some sort of deeper understanding and control of the technology, then it allows you to make better decisions.
Sean, what do you think? Is acknowledging Percy's understandable discomfort with the allusion to the Manhattan Project, do you think that some kind of Manhattan project in the works?
Absolutely. And I utilized the word moonshot earlier. I prefer moonshot over Manhattan Project, again, to remove some of those undesirable trimmings. But it's about having a clear objective or a stated objective and it's about applying inordinate amounts of funding from the public sector to approach it. And I look at the high performance computing projects at Los Alamos Laboratory or some of the other work being done at Sandia. And yes, a lot of that does support the security of our nuclear arsenal, but that performance computing capability can be applied to other purposes as well, or built on that expertise of those scholars there. So I definitely think that's possible. And, I look what we did with aviation and jet propulsion and rockets in the Skunk Works program decades back. For legal reasons, a lot of that couldn't be reproduced in this era because of the way military acquisition and funding occurs now. But that concept of government leading, working hand in hand with excellent private sector capabilities to produce something in the national interest, I do believe that is worthy and would yield wonderful results for our society.
All right, looking at the time we have left on the clock, we've got a couple of interesting questions here. Let's see if we can do maybe a lightning round and get through them. Dr. Aslan wants to know, Sean, we'll start with you here. What do you think? What are the practicalities and maybe ethical consequences of AI being used by judges and lawyers, or maybe even replacing them in some aspects in the future? And does AI have a role to play to have a higher quality legal system?
Yes, provided that it has a very clearly disclosed and non-biased training data and algorithm. I certainly don't want biased data training a judicial AI system to put away minority offenders for longer periods than their Caucasian counterparts who committed the same crime. So we need to be very circumspect about it. We need to be circumspect in when we use it. Is it going to replace the jury, or is it just going to be implemented in the sentencing phase? Is it going to be used in civil trials? Who knows? But I can clearly see it removing the subjectivity from the bench that unfortunately we see is quite prevalent across different jurisdictions, especially if we look at a national level instead of just within a single state.
Percy, I have a question here from Rowan, which I think is particularly apt for you. If you could give one piece of advice around ensuring the ethical adoption of AI, particularly generative AI, to corporations, what would it be? And he says, aside from using fair, appropriate, unbiased training data.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and a question that many corporations are asking themselves. I mean, I think one question is at the start is how much can you rely just on off-the-shelf models and systems such as, say, GPT-4, and how much do you have to build your own models? I think that is a very pertinent question. It used to be the case that whenever you want to do any sort of machine learning, you have to start with the data and you curate the data and you build a model. But now we have general purpose enough systems, and these systems can be lightly adapted to the given circumstances in a business. And the fact that many businesses all want roughly kind of very similar things, at least at an initial level, like they want to summarize documents, they want to do question answering. So I think that would be initial point is just to explore some of these options. And with regards to kind of the ethical adoption, I mean, I think ethics is also a very loaded word. It has many, I guess, different meanings here. But just to kind of maybe interpret it in a certain way, the ethical maybe deployment of AI, I think this requires much more attention, I think, more to the outputs. And again, think about measurement. That at the end of the day, the model is taking actions in the world, and you have to monitor carefully and its impact on users. This is kind of traditional, human-computer interaction, studies. I would place less emphasis actually on this notion of unbiased training data. I mean, I think maybe this is sort of a counterpoint to Sean's, and I think the problem is that it's very difficult to talk about unbiased training data in general. Maybe in very narrow settings, you can think about, bias. And if you think about a lot of these models, which are trained on, internet corpora, right? What does it mean to talk about unbiased? And in some cases, it might be desirable to actually learn about biases, learn that there is discrimination, learn that there are stereotypes, and then take explicit, alignment actions. So this is what people do to combat against it. So sometimes you kind of have to understand and model certain behaviors in the training data to kind of counteract that. But this is a more complicated matter that could take.
Well, on that note, and looking at the time, one final question before we end our time together for both of you. Sean, we can start with you. If you could recommend one resource, a book, a video, a series, something for the attendees of this webinar and their ecosystem to consume, to get a little bit smarter, a little bit wiser about the space, what would it be?
I have a very clear answer. I'm afraid Percy may not like me for saying it first. I'm an affiliate at Stanford, and I'm very familiar with their human-centered AI center there. Their 2024 AI Index report on trends in AI development, I think, is a great collection of data. It's incredibly well organized, and anyone would benefit deeply from reading through that report.
I think it's a super high calorie answer. Percy, what do you think? If you could recommend one thing to this audience, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, besides what Sean said, I was thinking about this a bit, and it's actually, because the field is changing so quickly, it's hard to, you can't point someone to a textbook and say, read this, and now you know AI. I would give one answer, which is there's no substitute for experiencing it. And one of the things that this latest generative AI revolution has made possible is that there is it's the accessibility, right? You just have to open up a web browser. You can go chat with these systems, unlike previous AI systems, which were much more specialized and you had to get special access. And I think through just playing with it, kicking the tires a bit, I think one starts to develop concrete intuitions about what these models can do and what they can't do. Because I think one thing people can look at, you can look at Twitter and you can see all these amazing examples. You can also see very bad examples. But concretely, how does it work in kind of a daily life situation in a maybe personal way can at least give you a different perspective on and deeper understanding of the technology.
I think that is an excellent note. I would like to thank the caucus and particularly Dr. Dunn for joining us today, CEE and Joanne DeGennaro for the wonderful introduction and the opportunity to have this panel, but most of all to you, the audience, for your thoughtful questions. We look forward very much to another set of webinars in the future where we can all learn and explore the space together. But in the meantime, thank you all for your attendance and attention, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a good day.